Hi, I'm Anker, Suffolk County Legislator. Thank you for joining us at Let's Talk. We have today a presentation on coastal erosion. In 2012, Superstorm Sandy caused extensive damage here on the North Shore of Long Island in my legislative district. I put together the North Shore Coastal Erosion Task Force, and you're going to be watching some of the ideas that we came up with to prevent and reduce coastal erosion. So sit back, enjoy the show. If you have any questions, feel free to call my office at 631-854-1600. And again, thank you for your attention to this matter. It's very important that we prevent coastal erosion, and we're going to give you some ideas of what you can do.
Bays and oceans naturally captivate and draw humans near, as evidenced by the high degree of residential homes and business development along coastal shorelines. The beaches and maritime climate also attract vacationers and support local economies with a wealth of recreational opportunities, expansive vistas, a diversity of wildlife, colorful sunsets, and productive embayments. However, while our coastlines are beautiful, development on our shoreline does not come without a high level of risk. Bluffs are a coastal feature that are particularly vulnerable to catastrophic loss, as their physical characteristics are prone to erosion caused by tidal scour, storm events, and land uses. Infrastructure on top of or on the bluff, such as homes, porches, patios, stairways, pools, fences, and landscaping remain continuously threatened by bluff erosion. In an effort to protect property values and associated infrastructure, millions of dollars are invested each year to mitigate the catastrophic effects of erosion and stabilize these eroding bluffs. It is important to recognize that bluff erosion and catastrophic failure cannot be predicted or completely prevented. However, the good news is that there are a number of affordable and effective management practices property owners can employ to help reduce the risk of bluff erosion. Not only are these practices simple to implement, but they are the most cost-effective means to stabilize an eroding bluff, reduce the risk of future failures, protect shoreline infrastructure, and maintain the value of your investments. Bluff erosion in the Atlantic coastal plain is focused on helping reduce the risk of bluff erosion. The first part, understanding erosion of coastal bluffs, begins by introducing the features that characterize a bluff and the various forces which lend to bluff erosion. The second, stabilizing and maintaining an eroding bluff, will identify the practices and measures which can be implemented in order to help mitigate the effects of erosion and highlight management and monitoring practices.
Geologically, the definition of a bluff is simply a high embankment or headland that has a very steep slope. Basically, what you have is it's a pretty high feature in some areas, but it can range from 9 feet high to over 120 feet, depending on where you are along the shoreline. Bluffs are not forming today. They're what we call relic features because the processes that built them are no longer operating.
These bluffs are actually glacial features. They were formed over 20,000 years ago when the area was covered by ice. The ice stopped here for a while and it dumped all the material that it was carrying that it had scraped down from Connecticut and points further north. And when it left, when these receded, It left everything from the boulders that you can see around me on the beach to fine clays and silts that are found in the bluff. So you have a remarkably mixed type of material here. Most of it is unconsolidated. It's loose. It's not held together by anything, so it's very easily erodable. And that's why we see the recession of the bluff that we do today.
Whether flanked by the Great Lakes, shaped by Long Island Sound, or buffering Cape Cod from oceanic waves, all bluffs share common features and characteristics which render them highly susceptible to erosion and innately unstable.
Well, erosion is a natural process. It's just the interaction between primarily storm waves and water levels and the bluff, and it's been occurring since the bluffs have been here over the last 22,000 years. We can see where they have receded.
The rocks that you see out there actually used to be in the bluff. So you can get an idea of what's happening here is that the shoreline is retreating as sea level rises over the long term, like it's been doing for the last 18,000 years. And then you can look up into the bluff and see some of these erratics up already are in the bluff now. But as the bluff erodes, they tend to roll down and they're left on the beach.
Erosion can be exacerbated by actions by man, whether that's blocking the sediment flow to an area, if you're using groins or jetties improperly, or preventing material from getting to the beach. So there are human influences that can affect erosion on the bluffs. But in most cases, not all, but most cases, they're relatively small compared to the natural forces causing erosion. Well, usually you can look down the coast here, and it's where you see an exposed face of the bluff. You don't have any vegetation on it. That indicates that something is going on. Then you have to take a look at, okay, exactly what's happening. The single most important factor affecting bluff erosion here on Long Island is wave action, particularly wave action at the toe of the bluff. It's the waves are the primary agent for picking up and removing material from the toe. And once they do that, they make the whole bluff face unstable. Usually they undercut the bluff, you'll have a scarp. That's an unstable situation, and the material will slide down the bluff face.
And if you look at some of the vegetation, you can actually see that even though it's vegetated, it looks like that vegetation is moving because you can see tree trunks coming out at an angle. They're not vertical to the horizon.
In the Northeast, we have more nor'easters than we do hurricanes. We get about 7 to 11 nor'easters a year on average. During the storms, you usually have the water elevations become higher than they are during the normal tidal cycles. So you have the storm tide, and that allows the water to get up to the toe of the bluff. We also have high winds during storms, which can kick up large waves. So you have the water level at the toe of the bluff, and then the waves on top of that that can come in and they pick up and remove the material and cause some of the most severe bluff erosion. On a local scale, in smaller areas, you might have things affecting the bluff, such as groundwater coming out. If you have a clay lens, groundwater can seep out of the bluff face and take material with it. You can have precipitation on the bluff, or you can have water running over the top edge of the bluff. Surface water runoff can also cause erosion of the bluff. And in certain cases, we have human activities. People walking up and down the bluffs can disturb the vegetation and allow the water to get into certain areas and cause the erosion. But overall, really what you have to look at is the wave action at the toe.
Looking at this bluff, we can observe all the characteristics of an unstable bluff. Vegetation in some areas and absent in others. Overhanging lips of vegetation, obvious signs of concentrated flow causing rills and gullies.
Well, I think in addition to the toe erosion, what you're seeing here is an area that has a good deal of groundwater seepage, and that's usually indicated where the gullies don't start at the top of the bluff. They actually start somewhere in the middle, between the toe and the top. And you can see that there's gullies there that are forming. It looks like the soil is a little bit wet. You really have to be out here after, some significant rainfall to be able to see the water actually coming through. But you see that characteristic feature where you have the gully, and then it comes down and you see these fans of sand like I'm standing on, where the material's coming down from the bluff and then coming out. And then the waves will come and pick this material up and transport either along the shore or offshore, depending on the wave direction and characteristic.
As we have highlighted, bluff erosion is a natural and continuous process that can also be catalyzed and magnified by numerous forces, including human land use decisions.
An issue or a concern when you have some type of development or a resource on top of the bluff that you want to protect. As the bluff erodes, it moves landward. As the edge moves towards these structures, if it's allowed to actually impinge on the structure, it'll destroy it. The structure will just slide down the bluff face.
Here we share an example of property damage caused by bluff erosion over the last 50 years. We met up with a coastal property owner on the north shore of Long Island who was willing to share his story of the devastating effects of bluff erosion.
I would say conservatively 3/4 of an acre.
3/4 of an acre worth
Right.
of linear feet out.
Exactly. Yep.
So maybe 150 feet.
Probably. Yeah.
So, and over how many years was that lost?
Well, the house was built in 41.
So what we're standing in right now is the basement and
Correct.
the garage.
So I'm happy to say we have our original porch floor, and I had a beautiful roof.
It is very evident that bluff erosion can be very costly, not only from a financial perspective, but it can also take a strong and emotional toll, as you can see in this case where Jeff continues to watch his family home and property crumble due to forces of nature. Coastal erosion processes are well understood and research continues to advance. However, predicting when, where, and the magnitude of loss remains unfortunately unpredictable. In fact, the only prediction that can be made is that erosion will occur. It is the physical characteristics of the bluff, such as the soils, the width of the beach, and the elevation of the toe, as well as the direct and indirect land use coupled with natural forces which drive and modify this iconic coastal feature. Although bluff erosion is a natural process that has been occurring since the retreat of the Wisconsin Glacier, it becomes a hazard when property and beach access are threatened and limited. Now that we understand the forces that drive bluff erosion, this next part is going to discuss how you can stabilize and maintain your bluff. The bluff is broken down into 3 management areas: the toe, the top, and the bluff face. In order to achieve or maintain stability, it is important to constantly monitor each of these areas. First, we must ensure the stability or protection of the toe and vertical faces. And finally, maintain appropriate vegetation on the bluff face. Effective bluff stabilization requires the ability to accurately identify locations where erosion is evident and use the proper methods to reduce or eliminate erosion. We will begin our discussion with the toe at the base of the bluff, then move to the top and finally discuss the measures to properly vegetate the bluff face.
I think that is the key thing. You cannot do anything even at the top or on the face until you have a stable toe in terms of preventing bluff erosion and preventing the top edge from moving landward. And what you'd want to do is you want to take a look, if you can get out there, especially during storms, to see if water is reaching the toe of the bluff. You can also look at the rack line or the high tide lines to see if they come up there on a regular basis. If you can get out in a storm, you can see, is the water getting up to the toe? If it is, then you're going to have to, if the objective is to stabilize the bluff, you're going to have to use some type of structure to provide protection for the toe. Vegetation alone will not work if you have wave action. Vegetation cannot stand up to direct wave action. It can supplement other measures that you might take, but if you have wave action at the toe, you have to, if you want to stabilize the bluff, you have to prevent that wave action from eating away at the material, and that usually involves a structure.
There's a number of different components. There's the pilings in the front. Usually the pilings are much longer than the sheet pile. They provide the structural integrity at the front of it. The tiebacks, which are, you can't see them in any of the bulkheads, they're usually buried. They're rods that go through, and they go to something called dead man, which is really logs. And then when the soil's put back behind it, those prevent the bulkhead from overturning. They actually keep it pulled this way. So it's the pilings keep the bulkhead from being too affected by the waves, and the sheet pile holds the material and the material behind it, the sand, absorbs the wave energy. And that's what people don't realize, that they lose the fill behind it. The next storm that comes through, it just knocks the bulkhead over. It essentially just cracks it right at the beach line. A good bulkhead will last anywhere from 20 to 40 years, depending on the conditions and if it's designed properly.
So
But if you don't take care of them, if you don't catch problems earlier, they can fail much earlier than that. Or in many cases, they're designed for a certain type of storm, and that storm can be exceeded, and then you can't really expect the structure to be maintained. When you're looking at tow protection for the bluff, it's very important that any protection you put in be continuous across the entire toe of the bluff. If you leave any gaps or holes, nature's going to exploit them and cause erosion. And in some cases, it'll actually exacerbate the erosion if you have a gap here. Here's something we have, it's called flanking. It's where there's a hole left in the bulkhead. The water can get in and get around to the back of the bulkhead itself. You can see that there's erosion occurring here. People have tried to pile up some rocks to slow it down. But if you notice at the back of the bulkhead, there's no material there. The longer this is open, the more material is going to be lost, and this bulkhead will be exposed to more damage from storms as the fill comes out from behind the bulkhead.
Achieving stability of the toe can be achieved with vegetation as long as the waves do not overwhelm the buffering capabilities. A wide beach, high shoreline elevation, short fetch, or the overwater distance between landforms increase the potential for vegetation persistence and thus toe stabilization. The best buffering capacity at the toe can be attained by establishing dense strands of vegetation using a diversity of salt-tolerant species. Beachgrass, Spartina patens, and seaside goldenrod are examples of such suitable species and can be used not only to revegetate the toe, but the entire bluff as well. We do not encourage turf grasses like your standard lawn grasses, but we recommend that you have dense vegetation. Species diversity is also strongly encouraged. Diversity reduces the likelihood of mass die-off of vegetation in the event of disease or natural decline, commonly associated with monoculture. The use of a diverse array of plant forms, types, and species also can help to ensure continued resiliency in the face of varied environmental factors that catalyze erosion.
In a lot of cases, what you find is you have a vertical scarp, the vertical face at the top of the bluff, and the problem with that is that it can be released at any time. It can be a catastrophic failure. So what you want to do is get that back to the flattest or the shallowest angle that you possibly can, where it's not going to interfere with what's on the top of the bluff. But if you can get it down, I mean, you should try for 1-on-3 would be ideal, but again, you can't always achieve that. The natural angle of repose of sand, for instance, is about 32 degrees. Now that's pretty shallow. If you just take a handful of sand and pour it down and look at that little mound it makes, the slope of that mound is the natural angle of repose. You don't really get that on the Long Island bluffs. It's very hard to get down to 32 degrees. Part of that is because it's made out of different types of materials. You can have clays, which when they're dry, they can have a more vertical slope. However, if they get too wet, the clay just becomes a liquid and goes out and can cause the erosion. So I think what you're trying to do is get the flattest slope that you can. Now, 1-to-1 is not a very good slope to have. It's a little bit too steep. If you can get it down to 1 to 1.5 to 2, ideally you'd like to get it down to 1 to 3, and that's 1 foot vertical for every 3 feet for 3 foot horizontal. The vertical face is actually unstable. So you're dealing with that area on top is unstable and can't really be used. And the other issue that you have is that going to be lost catastrophically when you have a readjustment of the bluff face if you have erosion, at the toe. And that is an issue that it can cause more damage as it releases and comes down if you try to vegetate the bluff face.
The next step in stabilizing an eroding bluff is to examine the bluff face in conjunction with the features at the top of the bluff to identify factors leading to instability. We must be able to properly identify and mitigate the factors contributing to erosion at the top of the bluff. Vertical faces, overhanging lips of vegetation, toppled trees, and gullies are signs and symptoms. Generally, water running over the top of the bluff or water being discharged to the bluff face from the soil column is the predominant catalyst for this erosion.
You want to make sure you don't have any overland flow coming over across the top of the bank, or you also want to try to avoid having water, too much water seeping down through the soil at the top of the bank, where it might come out, pipe out mid-bank or so, because that's going to create some additional problems. So you would want to have your land sloped away from the top of the bank. You would want to keep any surface flow or any infiltrated water, away from that bank, because that's going to create additional problems.
The final phase of stabilizing an eroding bluff is establishing and maintaining a densely vegetated face from the top to the toe. Not only is this vegetation integral to sediment and erosion control, it also provides equally important protection to water quality and wildlife habitat. Vegetation is the integral component to stabilizing a bluff face, as well as the roots weaving the soil into a stabilized matrix, while the above-ground vegetation slows the velocity of precipitation and runoff, encourages filtration, protects against wind erosion, facilitates the soil deposition, and helps maintain critical soil moisture and nutrients in the maritime desert. In order to receive the wide range of benefits afforded by this vegetation, a systematic approach to preparing the site, selecting appropriate plant materials, seeding and planting during the correct time of year, and follow-up with monitoring and care must be considered.
Well, you want to have a combination of different plants that are deep-rooted, that are native, some that would be quick establishing but may only live a few years, and others that are take a little longer to establish but may live long-term. You're basically just creating an integrated planting approach, but you're also using a mix of bunch-type grasses or bunch-type materials, as well as plants that spread rhizominously, that spread through lateral roots that form shoots. So you're going to have a mix of, say, fine fescues. You're going to have some little blue stem, American beach grass. You're going to have to put in vegetatively. Salt-meadow cordgrass is another, well-adapted coastal species, which you're also going to have to put in vegetatively. You would seed the bluff first, and you would seed from the top to the bottom. And you can just do a broadcast seeding, and maybe if you can get on the slope itself, incorporate it in as best you can, a little bit with some raking, some light raking. And then you would roll your fabric out from the top down and staple that in place. And then you would go back and maybe cut small holes with a box knife or a utility knife into the fabric where you're going to place your plugs. And you would put the plugs on the slope roughly, depending on the steepness and the availability of materials and things, roughly on a foot to a foot and a half spacing on center with a staggered spacing. So you want to try to cover the slope relatively evenly with materials. And if you were using some vegetative material like beach grass and cordgrass, you could intermix those two species, so you wouldn't have to necessarily have areas of solid beach grass and areas of solid cordgrass. You could kind of intermix them, just stagger them throughout the slope, and then you would have your seed mix underneath. And also adding flowering plants like seaside goldenrod's a perfect one.
A stable bluff provides the greatest level of protection by buffering against the forces that catalyze erosion and cause catastrophic property damage. Once a bluff fails, property damage and land loss down a bluff face are irreplaceable. Maintaining a stable bluff is the most economical means to reduce your risk of bluff erosion and protect property values, infrastructure, and beach access. Stormwater runoff, development, and landscaping are the factors atop the bluff that can contribute to erosion on the bluff face. The erosive potential of these forces must be evaluated on a case-by-case basis. Stormwater, impervious surfaces, irrigation systems, pools, and topography all increase the quantity and velocity of water that can be damaging to your bluff and investments. While precipitation or storm events cannot be prevented, nor can topography easily be modified, there are a number of cost-effective and commonly used measures easily implemented to help mitigate stormwater runoff. Implementation of green infrastructure practices will greatly reduce the amount of water cresting over the bluff. These practices allow for diversion and infiltration of excess water. Install gutters and downspouts to divert rooftop runoff into dry wells, rain gardens, or bioswales. Plants used in rain gardens and bioswales provide the added benefit of water treatment as well. Runoff from impervious surfaces such as patios and driveways can be reduced by using alternatives to patio block and concrete, such as interlocking permeable pavers or grid pavers, pervious concrete, and pervious asphalt, just to name a few. Irrigation systems are a popular feature for lawns and landscapes. While a useful feature for plant health, additional watering can have inadvertent impact when application occurs on or near a bluff. If irrigation is necessary, these guidelines will help to reduce the impact on the bluff. Avoid irrigation when soils are at capacity, for example, after a rainstorm. Automatic timers should be turned off when the weather is cool and rain is expected. Cut lawns higher. Increasing mow height will decrease evapotranspiration and improve water efficiency in plants. Install drip irrigation in gardens instead of sprinklers. Eliminate irrigation heads whenever possible. Use native plants. Native plants require little to no additional water. They have adapted to our climate. An unsuspecting source that poses a high degree of threat are pools due to the storage volume and weight bearing of the structure, which is generally in close proximity to the bluff face. Pools should have all water discharge into dry wells when draining and winterizing. Pool water should never be diverted over the bluff. These large volumes of water are highly erosive. Landscaping is used for many purposes, most commonly for aesthetics, attract wildlife such as birds and butterflies, and as privacy screens. Landscaping and its management can be molded to the land topography to further protect the bluff stability. Installation of vegetated buffers along the top edge and diversion for water into rain gardens further reduce the quantity and velocity of water. Trees naturally grow on the bluff face and atop of the bluff and can provide stability through their root systems. However, as they mature, their weight and canopy size increase the rocking of the tree and thereby increase the potential of toppling down the bluff face and catalyzing erosion. Trees along the edge of the bluff should be cut to ground level to prevent toppling. Lower sections of cut trees to the ground instead of dropping them on or down the bluff face. It is also good practice to not intentionally plant trees in this sensitive area. Never drop landscaping debris, such as leaves and branches, over the bluff face. Over time, this poor practice kills vegetation, opens bluff to erosion, and creates a mulch layer that smothers rather than adds to the critical vegetation that maintains bluff stability. Finally, it is imperative to understand that the steep slopes and unstable soil make the bluff a hazardous environment for recreation, travel, and structures. Access to the bluff should be limited. Any disturbance can become a cause for instability and erosion. Access should be limited to professionals with proper permits only when maintenance is required. If you need to conduct any work on your bluff or beach access stairwell, you must first seek out the advice of your local town or village and the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation. Due to the sensitive nature of the bluff, they are highly regulated. As we have highlighted, bluffs are a dynamic shoreline feature of cultural importance, with varying stages of stability and numerous modifying forces. Accordingly, effectively addressing bluff erosion requires dynamic and strategic approaches to ensure toe stability, a natural angle of repose, and dense vegetation for a functional bluff ecosystem. This video series has been made possible by a generous grant provided by the New York State Environmental Protection Fund, administered by the New York State Soil and Water Conservation Committee, New York State Department of Ag and Markets, and by the Suffolk County Soil and Water Conservation District, whose overarching goal is to protect and enhance natural resources by providing for today, protecting tomorrow. Technical services provided by New York Sea Grant and the USDA Natural Resources Conservation Service. Cape May Plant Materials Center has been invaluable in the production of this video series, as well as for developing and applying research and protections for thousands of miles of coastal shoreline in the Atlantic coastal plain.